for the first month and a half, but I made a concerted effort to be polite, and what it all came down to was that it didn't matter. I tried to be very polite, to establish myself as friendly and very positive in order to make my colleagues comfortable. So I selected this quote from my paper because I think that it really underscores the racialized nature of this particular feeling rule for this particular respondent. I think it's significant that she knows that she felt like a coon for the first month and a half because this is a very overtly racially charged comment, right? This is a very specifically racialized idea that this feeling of having to force herself to smile and force herself to be pleasant and force herself to be a positive person in an environment that she finds completely inhospitable really goes to mark this as something that speaks to very specific and very clearly racialized stereotypes and imagery. And that again, even in this environment, she's driving herself to really try to go out of her way to make sure that her colleagues are feeling comfortable with her. So she's feeling very uncomfortable, but she's still driven by this idea that there's this unspoken feeling rule within her organization that forces her to really have to make sure that other people are feeling comfortable, even if it puts her in a position where she's feeling that she's conforming to a very racially specific stereotype. So this is just one example of others, and this is one that takes place within the person's workplace. But this is just one particular example of this idea of how this experience of being tokenized, of feeling as though you are isolated, and feeling as though you're extremely visible, and feeling as though there are these racial dynamics that make the workplace difficult, can really connect to this broader experience of having difficulty following these feeling rules of expecting pleasantness. Uh-oh. The second feeling rule that I'll talk about is the experience of feeling irritation and anger. And this was a bit of a different feeling rule than the previous one. As I noted, the experience of being able to express pleasantness was one that the workers in my sample generally felt applied to all of the workers in their organizations, that everyone was expected to communicate pleasantness, but this was specifically harder for them because of their tokenized experience. When discussing the issues of irritation and anger, this came across a little bit differently. These workers argued that this was particularly a feeling rule to which they were not subject to be able to follow, and that anger was acceptable in certain contexts. And again, this is pretty consistent with the existing literature, some of which I spoke about, describing the ways in which anger can be acceptable or can be allowed as long as it's organizationally sanctioned in particular ways. So these employees felt that this was true for their work environments, that as long as anger generally was subject to appropriate organizational norms, it was okay. But they felt that it was definitely okay for other workers and not for them, that this was a feeling rule to which they didn't have access and were not able to comply. That they felt that their anger was never condoned, that while other workers in the organization could express anger, could express irritation, frustration, negative emotions like that, as long as they did it in an organizationally sanctioned way, for these workers, they had a sense that this was not anything that they could ever get away with. And they cited numerous examples of feeling that there were contrasts between the ways in which their white counterparts could express anger, often with impunity, and following these examples often with saying, you would never see me able to get away with things like this because I would get fired. I could never rant like this and get angry, and I could never talk to people this way and be this mad at work because nobody would allow me to continue to work in this environment. So another particularly prescient quote that encapsulates this comes from Jay, who's 25 and a systems analyst. And he was describing to me kind of this exact situation with a white female coworker of his who he felt was able to express anger with impunity towards her managers. And he says that she was in the process of giving a presentation about workplace-related initiative to managers, and the organization of her presentation wasn't tight, and she went off. What is it now? You guys are really getting on my nerves. And I'm like, wow, she's talking to managers like that? She's still there. Nothing's wrong. They met with her. I heard her threaten to quit, and they were like, no, don't quit. If it were me, they'd probably be like, all right, you know? So they say what they want. If someone says do this, they question it or they get smart. If it was me, I'd be labeled as an angry black dude, can't get along with coworkers. But because it's them, it's all right. Now, I selected this quote for a couple of reasons. One, because I think it's important to highlight that when Jay is talking about this expression of anger being sanctioned, he's referring to an example with a white female colleague who's able to express this sort of angry outburst without any sort of impunity. And it's important to point this out because I think that a lot of the existing literature that has focused on gender and emotions has made the argument that it's much easier for men to get away with expressing anger than it is for women to get away with expressing anger. But what I find from Jay's statement is that we have to really draw attention to the ways that intersections of race and gender really matter. And that for studies that have focused only on predominantly white samples and argue that men are more able to express anger than women, this may be a finding that's complicated when we consider the way that race plays into how this gender dynamic is emoted. That there may be more of a hierarchy there than is necessarily revealed if we're looking only at all white samples. In other words, these studies may find that white men are more able to express anger than white women, but that white women may also be more able to express anger than black men, particularly, again, if they're doing so through the established organizational channels. And this speaks to the importance of focusing on these intersections of race and gender and how they play out to shape the types of findings that we find in terms of not just looking at emotions, but looking at other issues more broadly. The second reason that I selected this quote to highlight this particular point is a related reason, that I think it's interesting to point out and very critical to point out that Jay identifies the stereotype of the angry black dude as the reason why he can't express his own anger and his own frustration. And I have another quote from Jay that I'll highlight later on. But I think it's very telling that he highlights how these intersections of race and gender put him in a position where even though he's a man, the fact that he's a black man makes him feel that he's less able to really express these types of feelings of anger, even if he were to go through the organizationally sanctioned challenges. That these images of the angry black man or the stereotype of the angry black man put him in a position where his masculinity doesn't necessarily offer him the ability to follow these feeling rules in the same ways that it might for other men in the organization. Continuing with this theme of irritation and anger, an additional point that many of the responses pointed out was that while they felt that anger was pretty much a no-no for them in many contexts, they were especially prohibited from expressing anger if it arose in response to racial issues. And they argued that here, the sanctions against showing anger were even more heightened. That anger was off limits generally, but was especially so regarding issues of racism. So they argued that while they definitely felt that there was this strong sense that they were not able to have access to this feeling rule, they felt that this rule was especially ironclad if it came to issues of race-related topics or incidents or comments that might arise, particularly in the workplace. So this was an area where they were firmly expected, not under any circumstances, to feel that they could express feelings of anger or irritation or frustration. So here's my second quote from Jay, continuing on to talk about his work experience in this context. And he says that Jay works in an environment that's pretty casual, as he describes here. And so he says that one guy came up to him one day and said that my shirt was nice, but maybe I should tuck it in. We have no office dress code. There's white men in the office that wear sneakers, jeans, and t-shirts. I had on khakis and a polo shirt. And he says I would look professional if I tucked my shirt in. I'm like, okay, but your office mates have on sneakers. There's different things that you want to say, but you can't. Or you could, but you might not be there long. And that's one of the struggles of being black in the workplace. You have to humble yourself, kind of like modern day sharecropping. So again, I point out this remark because I think that it's important to really identify the implicit racialization of the comment that Jay receives. Being told to tuck in your shirt is not on the face of it an overtly racialized remark, but it does speak to the experiences that black professionals have when they are in this tokenized environment. I talked earlier about this experience of heightened visibility and this idea of standing out when a person experiences the tokenized life, for lack of a better word. That this experience of being highly visible and this experience of standing out and this sense that black professionals aren't necessarily people who fit into the larger professional mold seems to be part of what's at play here in Jay's experience. This idea that he seems to stand out as someone who's not fitting this idea of professionalism, even though by his account, his colleagues aren't necessarily attired in a way that renders them any more professional than he is. I think goes to this argument about the ways in which racialized remarks are more covert in professional workplaces, but also that the ways in which they relate to the sort of token experiences that black professionals may have in a way that can cause feelings of anger and can cause feelings of frustration that then are not necessarily legitimized through the organizational structure. So this goes to show an example of, again, this sense of the ways in which tokenism can create particular feelings that aren't necessarily given the organizational legitimacy or the organizational ability to be expressed. One other interesting point to follow up with this question of feelings of anger and irritation has to do with black women. And again, this is another area where we see these intersections of race and gender coming to bear. That with some of the women with I spoke, not all by any means, but some of the black women with whom I spoke in my sample argued that this was actually an area where they would feel that sometimes they could get away with kind of breaking this rule. that for black women they would find that they could occasionally violate this norm and express their anger as a way of being taken seriously. And this is in some ways evocative of Maria Ang's research on the experiences of black women who were in engineering and physics, again a very male-dominated field and a very male-dominated profession. That these women, as I spoke of earlier, employed this sort of loud black girl stereotype as a way of gaining legitimacy and being taken seriously within their work structures. So too do I find that some of the black women in my sample sort of strategically employed this idea of being able to get angry as a way of getting people to listen to them and to take them seriously and to not sort of deride or blow off their comments. So here's a quote from Kima, who's a 43-year-old community educator that speaks to this point. And when I asked Kima her thoughts about the sorts of emotions that she had to control or the sorts of emotions that she had to tamp down in her workplace, she said to me, the main thing I had to control was not snapping on people. Why do I have to be in educator mode all the time and always have to explain how stupid what you just said was? So the main feelings I had to control were feelings of irritation and frustration. There was just no way to come into work as angry as I sometimes was. But you know what? I took full advantage of the fact that they were a little bit afraid of me. Sometimes it gave me the space to say what I needed to say. So as you see, this is a pretty stark difference from the comments that Jay made a few statements back. Jay describes, again, sort of a covertly racialized interaction with one of his colleagues, but also describes this feeling of having to humble himself, of how he terms it, this experience of modern-day sharecropping in the professional workplace. In contrast, we see a very different response from Kima in this particular setting, where she argues that this perception that colleagues are a little bit afraid of her gives her the space to get angry, to be irritated, and to be openly annoyed as a way of being taken seriously. Now I want to stress in saying this that this was not a consistent theme that I heard from all of the black women in my sample. This came up a few times enough to be noted as an interesting pattern, but it wasn't something that all of the black women in my sample said that they employed. But I think it's noteworthy to mention because of the contrast between their experiences and that of the black men with whom I spoke, who were often much more reticent about expressing their anger and never talked about this idea that they could possibly use it as a tool of being taken seriously. And I think, again, this goes back to the importance of thinking about these questions of intersections and of race and gender. Why is it that some black women felt that they were more able to sort of use anger as a tool than their black male counterparts? There's some research that suggests that black women may be perceived as more easily controllable by virtue of the intersections of race and gender, and perhaps not as fearsome and threatening as black men in professional workplaces. That may be what is at play here, that for these black women, they don't necessarily feel that the stereotype of the angry black woman has as much salience or as much power or as much controlling ability as black men feel that the image of the angry black man has for them. But I think it's important, an important question to raise because, again, it goes back to how much more we can learn when we think about how these intersections of race and gender are at play in professional workplaces and other settings than if we don't think about how these factors intersect to shape the experiences that these workers have. And my last point, in terms of looking at how these feeling rules may or may not be followed, comes back to the question of expressing racial fears and concerns. Actually all of my respondents talked about this experience that when it came to feelings about talking about racial issues and talking about racialized concerns, that they were not permitted to share feelings about working in an integrated setting, but that their white coworkers, in contrast, were able and even encouraged to do this, again, provided that it took place in the appropriate organizational settings. And in these contexts, this usually occurred during diversity trainings or diversity workshops. And in modern professional environments, these are not necessarily uncommon, that most professional environments, at least if it's enough